Hey, are you still awake? Long day. Maybe work refused to end your to-do list. Somehow became longer instead of shorter. Or your brain has decided that 2 in the morning is the perfect time to replay every slightly awkward conversation you've had this week. If that's the case, you're in good company. Humans have always found wonderfully creative ways to make life more complicated than necessary. So, tonight, do me one small favor. Let your shoulders sink a little lower. Unclench your jaw and one slow breath, and let the day drift quietly into the background. Because tonight, we're traveling somewhere that might make you appreciate one very modern luxury you almost never think about. Your own bed. Not a larger bed, not a softer bed, just your own. Because for much of medieval Europe, the idea of climbing into bed beside someone you had never met before wasn't unusual, embarrassing, or even especially interesting. It was Tuesday. Imagine arriving at a roadside inn after walking nearly 20 miles through rain mud, and roads that occasionally forgot they wanted to be roads at all. Your boots are soaked. Your shoulders ache from carrying everything you own. The sun has disappeared. Wolves are rumored to be somewhere beyond the trees, and the village gates have already closed behind you. The innkeeper greets you warmly. Good news, he says. There's still one bed available. Excellent, you think. Then he casually adds that 6 other people are already sleeping in it. And nobody, not the innkeeper, not the other travelers, not even you, finds this particularly shocking. To a medieval traveler, the surprising part wasn't sharing the bed. The surprising part would have been getting an entire one to yourself. Modern people often assume privacy is one of those timeless human desires, something everyone naturally wanted, but previous generations simply couldn't afford. History, however, enjoys politely clearing its throat before informing us that the situation was considerably stranger. Privacy, at least as we understand it today, was often treated less like a fundamental right and more like an expensive hobby. The average medieval person spent remarkably little time alone. Homes were crowded. Work was communal. Meals were communal. Religious life was communal. Even using the toilet frequently became an unexpectedly social event, something we have already explored with the appropriate level of historical sympathy. Sleep simply followed the same pattern. If anything, nighttime gathered people even closer together. Part of this came down to economics. Beds were astonishingly expensive, not simply because wood required labor, or because mattresses demanded materials that took time to produce, but because every component represented hundreds of hours of someone's effort. A sturdy oak bed frame might require an experienced carpenter. The ropes supporting the mattress had to be woven. Feather mattresses required thousands upon thousands of goose feathers. Blankets represented months of spinning wool. Linen sheets demanded fields of flax, harvesting, soaking, beating, spinning, weaving, bleaching, and sewing. When everything involved countless hours of skilled labor performed entirely by hand, furniture stopped being disposable. A bed became one of the most valuable possessions a household owned. Sometimes it appeared alongside livestock and land in wills. Parents proudly left beds to their children. Newly married couples celebrated receiving one. Entire families measured wealth by how many proper beds they possessed, rather than how many people lived inside the house. Unfortunately, families had an inconvenient habit of producing children faster than they produced furniture. So everyone simply adapted. One bed, several sleepers, problem solved. At least by medieval standards. To modern ears, this arrangement sounds impossibly uncomfortable. Surely nobody could sleep peacefully while squeezed between strangers who had spent the previous week walking behind ox carts. Yet medieval expectations were wonderfully different. People did not expect uninterrupted silence. They did not expect perfect darkness. They certainly did not expect personal sleeping space carefully calibrated to their preferred mattress firmness. Night was naturally noisy. Dogs barked, wind rattled shutters, babies cried, roosters frequently became confused about what time sunrise actually occurred. Someone snored, usually several people. Life itself refused to become quiet simply because the sun disappeared. So people developed astonishing flexibility. If another sleeper rolled over, you adjusted. If someone muttered prayers while half asleep, you ignored it. If an old merchant talked about sheep during his dreams, well, apparently, his imaginary flock required careful supervision. Human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures, especially when alternatives include sleeping outside. Outside, unfortunately, remained enthusiastic about killing people. Cold alone claimed countless lives. Rain soaked clothing that might never properly dry. Bandits preferred isolated travelers. Wild animals occasionally misunderstood the distinction between passing stranger and late-night snack. Even without dramatic dangers, exposure gradually weakened the body. One warm shared bed often represented genuine survival. Body heat mattered quite a lot. Modern central heating has spoiled us into believing warmth naturally appears after adjusting a thermostat. Medieval warmth required considerably more cooperation. Fireplaces heated only parts of a room. Stone walls surrendered warmth almost immediately after flames died down. Glass windows remained uncommon and inefficient. Drafts wandered through houses with the confidence of tax collectors. Every additional sleeping body became another small furnace. Human beings generate an impressive amount of heat. One sleeper stays warm. 2 sleepers stay warmer. 6 sleepers begin resembling an oddly shaped heating system. 7 sleepers perhaps resemble an overcrowded bakery. Either way, everyone freezes a little less. What sounds deeply inconvenient today often represented intelligent energy conservation. Even wealthy households sometimes embraced communal sleeping arrangements. Noble families certainly owned better furniture. Their beds could be magnificent creations, carved with elaborate designs, decorated with embroidered curtains, colorful fabrics, and expensive feather mattresses. Yet servants frequently slept nearby. Children often shared rooms. Attendants remained close enough to respond immediately if needed. Complete solitude during sleep still wasn't guaranteed. Royal households could become particularly fascinating. Kings and queens possessed magnificent beds worthy of admiration. Unfortunately, those rooms were rarely private. Courtiers entered. Servants attended fires. Officials delivered messages. Doctors checked health. Priests offered prayers. Nobles discussed politics. Sometimes important conversations happened while someone was technically still lying in bed. The bedroom functioned almost like another reception room. Imagine trying to enjoy a peaceful Sunday morning while Parliament quietly assembled beside your pillow. Medieval rulers experienced versions of exactly that. The bed itself symbolized authority. Privacy remained optional. Hospitality also transformed sleeping customs. Offering a traveler somewhere warm to sleep carried enormous moral importance. Christian teachings repeatedly emphasized caring for strangers. Monasteries welcomed pilgrims. Villages assisted visitors. Families squeezed unexpected guests into already crowded sleeping arrangements because refusing shelter might appear both cruel and sinful. Nobody asked whether sleeping beside Uncle Thomas' 2 cousins, an unfamiliar merchant, and 1 exhausted pilgrim created ideal sleeping conditions. They asked whether everyone survived the night. Comfort ranked below charity. This attitude appears repeatedly throughout medieval records. Visitors rarely complained about sharing beds. Instead, they expressed gratitude for receiving shelter at all. The alternative involved darkness, weather hunger, and uncertainty. Suddenly, sharing blankets with someone whose feet smelled suspiciously like fermented onions became surprisingly acceptable. Perspective changes everything. In fact, medieval writers occasionally described excellent hospitality by praising generous sleeping arrangements. A host willing to surrender precious bed space demonstrated kindness. Beds represented wealth. Sharing wealth represented virtue. Today, we might offer guests Wi-Fi passwords. They offered blanket space. Different centuries. Same intention. Of course, this did not mean everyone adored communal sleeping. Far from it. People still preferred cleanliness whenever possible. They appreciated polite companions. Nobody celebrated enthusiastic snoring. Nobody applauded chronic blanket thieves. Human nature has apparently remained wonderfully consistent for centuries. Some medieval jokes quietly complained about unpleasant sleeping companions. Others warned travelers to watch their belongings while sharing crowded inns. Trust existed. Blind trust did not. And perhaps that becomes one of the most revealing discoveries tonight. Communal sleeping wasn't evidence that medieval people lacked intelligence or sophistication. Instead, it reflected an entirely different calculation. Resources were limited. Heat mattered. Furniture cost fortunes. Communities relied upon cooperation. The question wasn't, would I like to share my bed? It was, would I rather share this bed or freeze outside? Remarkably often, the answer required very little thought. As the fire settled lower inside a timber cottage, and another traveler quietly climbed beneath heavy wool blankets beside complete strangers, nobody believed they were participating in an extraordinary cultural practice. They believed they were simply going to sleep, and perhaps that is the strangest revelation of all. The customs that seem almost unbelievable to us were completely invisible to the people living them, just as our own everyday habits may someday leave future historians smiling softly, wondering why 21st century humans insisted on sleeping entirely alone, despite possessing houses warmer than castles, softer mattresses than kings, and enough spare blankets to make a medieval innkeeper faint from pure astonishment. If sharing a bed inside an ordinary village home sounds crowded, the medieval inn managed to elevate the experience into something closer to an accidental social experiment. Picture a timber-framed building standing beside a muddy road that connected one market town to another. Outside, a weathered sign creaked gently in the evening breeze. Inside, the warm glow of rushlights struggled against the darkness, gathering beyond tiny windows. The air carried an unforgettable combination of wood smoke, damp wool, roasted onions, spilled ale, wet leather, horse sweat, and perhaps just a faint suggestion that someone had recently attempted to improve the smell with herbs that surrendered almost immediately. Modern hotels advertise private rooms. A medieval inn often advertised something far more practical: a roof. Everything beyond that became negotiable. The wealthiest travelers might secure an entire chamber if one happened to be available. Merchants carrying expensive goods occasionally paid extra for privacy, partly to protect themselves from thieves, and partly because they had reached that pleasant stage of life where uninterrupted sleep had become more valuable than another silver coin. Everyone else accepted whatever space remained. Sometimes that meant a mattress, sometimes straw spread across wooden boards, sometimes a bench, sometimes the floor, and quite often it meant sliding carefully beneath blankets already occupied by complete strangers who politely shifted an elbow to make room. Nobody introduced themselves first. There was rarely time. Everyone simply wanted warmth before the fire burned too low. The medieval concept of personal space would probably leave a modern commuter on a crowded subway feeling surprisingly understood. Distance between bodies was considered a luxury rather than a necessity. Children grew up sleeping beside siblings. Apprentices slept beside fellow apprentices. Servants shared lofts. Monks occupied long dormitories, where dozens of identical beds stood in neat rows, each reminding its occupant that humility apparently included listening to Brother Matthew snore like an elderly ox every single evening. Communal sleeping became so familiar that people stopped noticing it. What we consider intimacy often looked like practicality. This difference shaped how medieval Europeans thought about trust. Today, allowing a stranger into your bedroom would likely result in a lengthy conversation with the police, several concerned neighbors, and perhaps an awkward explanation to your insurance company. In the Middle Ages, sleeping beside unfamiliar travelers could simply mean everyone happened to arrive before sunset. Of course, trust did not mean innocence. Travelers remained cautious. Money pouches stayed tucked beneath clothing. Knives often remained within easy reach, not because everyone expected midnight duels, but because a personal knife represented one of life's most useful possessions. Losing it could complicate tomorrow far more effectively than losing sleep tonight. Shoes were placed carefully where they could be found before dawn. Bundles containing spare clothing became pillows. A surprisingly uncomfortable pillow, perhaps, but one that discouraged wandering hands. Human beings, after all, have always possessed a healthy awareness that opportunity occasionally inspires questionable decisions. The innkeeper himself occupied a fascinating position. He acted simultaneously as host, referee, accountant, cook, stable manager, fire tender, occasional physician, and unofficial judge, whenever two exhausted travelers began arguing over whose elbow had crossed an invisible boundary in the bed. His success depended upon maintaining peace. An inn known for frequent theft or violence quickly lost business. News traveled astonishingly well along medieval roads. Merchants talked, pilgrims talked even more. One unhappy guest could unintentionally advertise your terrible establishment across half a kingdom. Long before online reviews existed, reputation still determined survival. Except instead of receiving one angry star rating, your inn simply stopped receiving travelers. Sometimes medieval records describe beds so crowded that historians have quietly wondered how anyone managed to sleep at all. One English source suggests several unrelated adults sharing a single large bed. Another mentions travelers lying head to toe to maximize available space. The arrangement sounds almost comically uncomfortable until one remembers the alternative involved cold rain and wolves that had absolutely no interest in respecting personal boundaries either. Suddenly, another person's cold foot seems like a relatively manageable inconvenience. Blankets themselves became precious. Unlike modern bedding produced by machines, every medieval blanket represented countless hours of spinning, weaving, washing, and repairing. A thick wool blanket could accompany someone through decades of life. It kept babies warm, covered the sick, protected travelers, served as emergency cloaks, even appeared in wills alongside valuable household possessions. Sharing one, therefore, represented more than simple hospitality. It demonstrated genuine generosity. Occasionally, though, generosity encountered predictable human nature. Anyone who has ever shared blankets with a restless sleeper already understands one timeless truth. There is always one person who somehow ends the night wrapped comfortably inside nearly every available layer, while everyone else quietly negotiates with the laws of thermodynamics. History remains frustratingly silent regarding the identities of medieval blanket thieves. One suspects they existed in impressive numbers. Another curious habit involved sleeping without removing every layer of clothing. Today, most people change into sleepwear. Medieval travelers often remained partially dressed. Their garments represented expensive investments and valuable protection against cold. Undressing completely inside a communal room filled with strangers felt neither practical nor particularly wise. A cloak folded beneath the head became a pillow. Boots stayed nearby. Belts loosened but remained close. Morning departures could happen quickly, especially if daylight offered the safest opportunity for continuing one's journey. The rhythm of medieval sleep itself differed from ours in subtle ways. Many historians believe people commonly experienced what has become known as segmented sleep. Instead of expecting 8 uninterrupted hours, they often slept for several hours after sunset, naturally woke during the middle of the night, spent quiet time praying, talking softly, tending fires, checking animals, or simply thinking before returning to sleep until dawn. Imagine waking at 2 in the morning today. Most of us immediately assume something has gone wrong. A medieval villager might simply shrug, add another log to the fire, whisper a prayer exchange, a few sleepy words with someone nearby, and drift peacefully back beneath heavy blankets. Insomnia was not always treated as an enemy. Sometimes it was simply another part of the night's gentle rhythm. This makes communal sleeping seem even more remarkable. Picture several strangers briefly awake together in the dim glow of fading embers. Nobody reaching for the glowing screen, nobody checking unread emails, nobody scrolling endlessly through news capable of convincing anyone that civilization had permanently collapsed before breakfast. Instead, perhaps someone quietly mentioned tomorrow's road conditions. Another traveler offered directions toward a monastery. Someone laughed softly about a stubborn mule refusing to cross a bridge. Within minutes, silence returned. The only sounds became slow-breathing, crackling wood and distant wind pressing gently against timber walls. For all its obvious discomforts, communal sleeping occasionally created fleeting communities. People who would never meet again shared stories, warmth, and simple humanity during a single night before continuing separate journeys at sunrise. A merchant from one kingdom might sleep beside a pilgrim from another. A mason searching for work might exchange advice with a shepherd returning home. Languages mixed, accents collided, ideas traveled almost as efficiently as people did. The bed became rather unexpectedly a tiny crossroads of medieval Europe, and perhaps that is another irony history quietly enjoys presenting. The place modern people consider intensely private sometimes became one of the most surprisingly social spaces in the medieval world. If crowded inns revealed how medieval people shared sleep with strangers, ordinary family homes revealed something perhaps even more surprising. The medieval house itself was rarely designed around privacy because privacy simply wasn't the goal. Survival was. Imagine stepping inside a modest peasant cottage just after sunset. The entire building might consist of one main room beneath a roof blackened by years of smoke. The fire burned in the center or inside a simple hearth depending on the region and the century. Chickens occasionally wandered indoors. A dog curled itself near the warmest stones with the confidence of someone who had absolutely no intention of paying rent. A cat, meanwhile, behaved exactly as cats continue to behave today, offering only enough affection to ensure continued access to mice. Every member of the household lived almost every part of life inside this single shared space. Cooking happened here. Clothes were repaired here. Children learned their first lessons here. Grandparents told stories here. Neighbors occasionally visited here. Someone might be spinning wool, while another sharpened a tool, while another quietly mended shoes. Then, when darkness finally settled outside, the room did not transform into a collection of private bedrooms. It simply became the same room, only horizontal. Furniture itself often performed multiple jobs. A bench became a bed. A wooden chest became a seat by day and supported bedding by night. Straw mattresses were rolled out onto the floor and collected again the following morning. Every evening, the house quietly rearranged itself, almost like a carefully rehearsed performance everyone had memorized since childhood. Children rarely questioned it. Why would they? To them, this was simply what houses did. Today's children might wonder where the Wi-Fi password is. A medieval child wondered whether they would get the warm spot closest to the fireplace before an older sibling claimed it first. Entire families commonly slept together. Parents, children, infants, sometimes grandparents, occasionally unmarried relatives. If the family employed a servant, that servant might sleep nearby as well. Modern readers often react with immediate surprise. Surely this offered no privacy whatsoever. Exactly, it didn't. But privacy occupied a surprisingly low position on the medieval hierarchy of needs. Warmth ranked higher, security ranked higher, watching over children ranked much higher. Infant mortality remained painfully common throughout medieval Europe. Parents had every practical reason to keep babies close. A child developing a fever during the night required immediate attention. A crying infant might simply need warmth feeding or comfort. Sleeping together allowed parents to respond instantly. From their perspective, separate nurseries would have seemed not luxurious, but strangely inconvenient. Older children benefited as well. Night remained genuinely dark, not metaphorically dark, actually dark. Once candles burned low and the fire faded, the room dissolved into almost complete blackness. Without streetlights, electric lamps illuminated clocks, glowing screens, or distant city skylines, darkness became nearly absolute. Many adults today have never experienced such complete absence of artificial light. Medieval children experienced it every evening. Understandably, they often preferred not facing it alone. And honestly, who could blame them? If your imagination had already been thoroughly supplied with stories involving wandering spirits, forest demons, witches, flying beneath moonlight, sightless ghosts, mysterious travelers, and the occasional devil, apparently determined to interfere with perfectly ordinary evenings, sleeping beside your parents suddenly seemed like excellent strategic planning. The medieval night possessed remarkable persuasive powers. Religious belief added another fascinating layer. Many households ended the day with prayers before climbing beneath blankets. The act was not merely spiritual, but practical. Sleep itself resembled a tiny surrender. Every night, consciousness disappeared. Dreams arrived without invitation. No one truly understood why. For medieval Christians, asking God for protection before sleep made perfect sense. You were placing yourself into a mysterious condition where the soul seemed strangely vulnerable. Better to request a little divine supervision. Dreams fascinated medieval thinkers. Some believed dreams carried messages from God. Others worried they might originate from darker forces. Monastic writers spent centuries debating exactly how dreams should be interpreted. If you dreamed of heaven, was it divine encouragement? If you dreamed of something embarrassing, had temptation found another doorway? If you dreamed about accidentally losing all your chickens while arguing with a talking goat, well, perhaps everyone agreed not every dream required theological analysis. The human brain has always enjoyed entertaining itself. Sharing sleeping space also meant sharing the strange noises of sleep itself. Snoring naturally existed long before modern medicine invented elegant names for it. Sleep talking entertained households for generations. Children laughed about it. Adults pretended they never did it themselves. One suspects this denial has remained remarkably consistent throughout history. Then there were nightmares. Without modern psychology, terrifying dreams frequently acquired supernatural explanations. Someone crying out in sleep might receive sympathetic prayers the following morning. Parents reassured frightened children. Neighbors exchanged stories about similar experiences. Entire communities interpreted dreams through the lens of shared beliefs rather than medical science. Yet despite all these fears, nighttime rarely became chaotic. People accepted uncertainty with surprising calm, perhaps because uncertainty itself formed such a familiar companion throughout life. Harvests failed. Illness appeared suddenly. Storms destroyed crops. Accidents happened. Death arrived more frequently and far earlier than modern societies generally expect. Against this background, sleeping close together offered emotional reassurance as much as physical warmth. You were not facing uncertainty alone. That may have mattered more than the mattress itself. Even wealthy households reveal this fascinating balance between status and practicality. Great halls inside castles could appear magnificent during daylight. Long tables overflowed with food during feasts. Colorful banners decorated stone walls. Music echoed beneath high timber ceilings, yet nighttime transformed these impressive spaces. Servants often slept inside the great hall itself after fires burned low. Portable bedding appeared. Benches became makeshift beds. Dogs claimed comfortable corners with professional efficiency. The room quietly shifted from royal ceremony to communal dormitory. Only the highest-ranking family members withdrew into more private chambers. Even then, private remained a flexible concept. Attendants frequently slept nearby. Ladies-in-waiting remained available. Personal servants answered calls during the night. A noblewoman might possess magnificent embroidered curtains surrounding her bed, but curtains created visual separation more effectively than true isolation. The idea that every individual deserved an entirely separate sleeping room belonged to a much later world. The medieval household functioned collectively. Its architecture reflected that reality. One particularly charming detail involves bedtime conversation, without books. For most people, without recorded music, without radio, television, or endless online entertainment, people often ended the day simply talking. Stories flowed naturally beneath blankets. Grandparents repeated old legends. Parents discussed tomorrow's work. Children whispered until someone firmly suggested that enough whispering had occurred. Travelers exchanged tales collected along distant roads. Some stories undoubtedly grew slightly more impressive each time they were retold. Human beings have always edited reality whenever a good audience presented itself. Perhaps a fisherman remembered catching a fish slightly larger than last year. Perhaps a merchant recalled surviving dangers that became progressively more dramatic with every retelling. Perhaps someone claimed to have seen a ghost. Nobody could immediately verify such things. The night encouraged imagination. Then gradually conversation faded. One voice disappeared, another followed. The fire settled lower. Someone turned over beneath heavy blankets. Outside, the wind moved through trees exactly as it had for thousands of years. Inside, dozens of quiet breaths slowly merged into one gentle rhythm. It is easy to picture communal sleeping only through the lens of inconvenience. Certainly, there were inconveniences. Someone always occupied too much space. Children occasionally kicked without warning. Blankets migrated mysteriously during the night. One unfortunate individual almost certainly developed a reputation for producing snores capable of alarming nearby livestock. Yet focusing only on discomfort risks missing something remarkably human. These crowded sleeping arrangements reflected societies built upon cooperation. People survived because they shared labor, shared food, shared tools, shared responsibilities. And when darkness arrived, they shared warmth. Perhaps modern comfort has quietly convinced us that independence is the natural human condition. History whispers something rather different. For most of our existence, survival rarely belonged to the individual. It belonged to the group. Even something as deeply personal as sleep became another reminder that life worked best when people stayed close enough to hear one another breathing in the darkness, quietly reassuring themselves that morning would come and that nobody would have to face it alone. By now, it might seem that medieval people simply accepted sleeping beside anyone who happened to be nearby. But there was one place where this curious habit became almost an art form: the monastery. If an inn was a social experiment accidentally created by exhausted travelers, A monastery was a carefully organized community where sharing nearly every aspect of life, including sleep, was considered part of becoming a better human being. That may sound wonderfully peaceful until you remember that monks snored. Quite a lot, judging from the occasional complaints hidden inside medieval writings. A medieval monastery rarely resembled the silent, isolated retreat that modern films enjoy portraying. During daylight, it buzzed with surprisingly practical activity. Someone copied manuscripts. Someone worked in the gardens. Someone brewed ale. Someone repaired roofs. Someone cared for the sick. Someone inevitably discovered that Brother Peter had once again forgotten where he left the only hammer in the building. Holiness, it turns out, still required maintenance. When night arrived, the brothers gathered inside long dormitories rather than disappearing into private bedrooms. Rows of simple beds stretched across the room. Sometimes they were separated by only a narrow gap, sometimes even less. Depending upon the monastery, privacy ranged somewhere between limited and entirely theoretical. This arrangement wasn't merely about saving money. It reflected a philosophy. Monastic life encouraged humility, owning little, expecting little, thinking less about personal comfort and more about spiritual discipline. Having your own luxurious bedroom would have seemed oddly suspicious. Comfort. Many religious writers warned had a troubling habit of encouraging laziness. The devil, according to some sermons, appreciated an overly comfortable mattress almost as much as an idle mind. It was a rather unfair accusation against perfectly innocent mattresses. Still, the message remained clear. Simple living built stronger character. Of course, medieval monks remained gloriously human despite these ideals. Rules existed because people repeatedly broke them. One monastery instructed brothers not to whisper after lights out, which strongly suggests whispering had become something of a nighttime hobby. Another warned against unnecessary conversation in the dormitory. Apparently, someone always had one last fascinating story to tell, just as everyone else was trying to sleep. Even communities devoted entirely to discipline discovered that bedtime conversations possess remarkable staying power. Parents today may feel strangely reassured. Some things never change. Monastic rules also reveal an unexpected concern for accountability. Sleeping together meant everyone could observe everyone else. No one disappeared during the night without explanation. No one secretly indulged in luxuries. No one quietly wandered away without someone noticing. Communal sleeping reinforced communal responsibility. The individual became part of the rhythm of the entire community. This idea extended well beyond monasteries. Guild apprentices often slept together inside workshops. Imagine a teenage apprentice learning the craft of blacksmithing, weaving, carpentry, or shoemaking. During the day, he worked beside experienced craftsmen. During the evening, he ate with them. At night, he rolled out bedding alongside fellow apprentices under the same roof, where tomorrow's work would begin. The workshop itself became home. The master craftsman acted almost like another parent. His wife often supervised meals. Older apprentices quietly taught younger ones. Learning a profession meant joining an extended household rather than merely accepting employment. Modern internships rarely include sleeping beside your supervisor. History occasionally enjoys reminding us that boundaries once looked remarkably different. Universities followed similar patterns. Students attending medieval Oxford, Paris, or Bologna frequently shared cramped accommodations that modern college students might describe as character building. Rooms overflowed with books copied painstakingly by hand clothing that had definitely seen better days. Boots drying near smoky fires, and young scholars attempting to balance philosophical debates with the practical challenge of finding enough blanket to survive winter. Some historians joke that medieval students complained about roommates almost exactly as students do today. One roommate stayed awake too late, another borrowed belongings, someone forgot to clean, someone snored, someone talked endlessly about Aristotle. Admittedly, only one of those complaints has become slightly less common. The military offered another fascinating example. Soldiers rarely enjoyed private sleeping arrangements unless they occupied the highest ranks. Campaign tents housed multiple men. Barracks packed soldiers closely together. Night watches alternated while others slept nearby. Shared sleeping created familiarity. Men learned each other's habits. Who woke easily, who slept deeply, who panicked during storms, who remained calm. Trust developed gradually through countless ordinary nights rather than dramatic moments on battlefields. Perhaps that explains why medieval friendship often carried remarkable depth. People literally entrusted one another with their sleeping hours. There exists another delightful irony hiding beneath all these examples. Modern culture often celebrates independence. Your own apartment, your own bedroom, your own office, your own carefully protected personal bubble. Medieval society generally admired interdependence instead. Living closely together wasn't considered failure. It was evidence that people belonged somewhere. A person completely alone frequently appeared vulnerable rather than successful. Even language reflected these assumptions. The medieval household included relatives, servants, apprentices, hired workers, guests, and occasionally travelers. The line separating family from community remained surprisingly flexible. People entered and left these households throughout life. Children became apprentices. Pilgrims arrived unexpectedly. Visiting relatives stayed for weeks. Widowed grandparents moved in. Communal sleeping adapted naturally because communal living already existed. Hospitality itself became almost sacred. Across Christian Europe, welcoming strangers carried profound religious meaning. Many believed Christ himself might appear disguised as a traveler. Ignoring someone in need therefore carried uncomfortable theological implications. Offering food mattered. Offering warmth mattered. Offering somewhere safe to sleep mattered perhaps most of all. The guest might be poor. The guest might be wealthy. The guest might smell faintly alarming after several weeks on muddy roads. None of that erased the obligation to provide shelter if circumstances allowed. Of course, practical wisdom accompanied generosity. Guests were welcomed. Valuables remained carefully stored. Kindness and caution happily coexisted. Human beings have always managed that delicate balance remarkably well. One medieval traveler might receive supper a place beside the fire and half a blanket, while simultaneously being watched just carefully enough to ensure the household still owned its spoons the following morning. Trust? Yes, but perhaps not unlimited trust. As centuries passed, however, these customs slowly began changing. Beds became more affordable. Homes gradually acquired additional rooms. Urban wealth increased. Furniture production improved. Glass windows became more common. Heating slowly became more efficient. Ideas about personal dignity and domestic privacy quietly evolved. People didn't suddenly wake one morning announcing that strangers should no longer share beds. The transformation happened almost invisibly. Generation after generation added small improvements. One extra room here, one additional bed there. Eventually, what had once been ordinary survival became something future generations found almost unimaginable. Yet for hundreds of years before that transformation, millions of perfectly ordinary people ended each day exactly the same way. They removed muddy boots, whispered evening prayers, adjusted shared blankets, made room for whoever still needed somewhere warm to sleep, and considered the entire arrangement so completely normal that it barely deserved mentioning at all. Sometimes history's greatest surprises are not the spectacular events recorded in royal chronicles. Sometimes they are the quiet routines that everyone took for granted, until time carried them gently away. The quiet disappearance of communal sleeping may be one of history's most remarkable transformations, precisely because almost nobody noticed it happening. There was no grand proclamation declaring that from this day forward, every person deserved a bed of their own. No medieval king stood before a cheering crowd to announce the revolutionary invention of personal space. Instead, the change crept forward one generation at a time, as slowly and quietly as sunrise slipping across a village field. A family became slightly wealthier. A carpenter built one extra bed. A house gained another small room. A growing town produced better furniture. A merchant imported finer blankets. A prosperous inn discovered that travelers would gladly pay a little more for the astonishing luxury of sleeping beside absolutely nobody. What had once been unimaginable slowly became desirable, then expected, eventually normal. Today, many of us spend an extraordinary amount of effort protecting our bedrooms from interruption. We buy blackout curtains, white noise machines, memory foam mattresses, cooling pillows, heated blankets, orthopedic mattresses, ergonomic pillows, and devices that monitor whether we are sleeping correctly while quietly judging us if we are not. A medieval farmer would probably stare at this collection of sleeping technology with genuine fascination before politely asking one simple question. So, why are you all still so tired? History has a wonderfully mischievous sense of humor. The people who slept beside strangers, siblings, grandparents, servants, travelers, apprentices, and occasionally someone whose name they never even learned, often expected nothing more than warmth and enough rest to survive tomorrow's labor. We, with bedrooms larger than some medieval cottages, sometimes lie awake worrying that the pillow is perhaps 2% less comfortable than yesterday. Neither society is entirely right. Neither is entirely wrong. They simply solve different problems. For medieval Europeans, sleep was rarely treated as an individual experience. It belonged to the household, to the family, to the community, to survival itself. Every sleeping body contributed warmth. Every nearby voice offered reassurance. Every familiar breath drifting softly through the darkness quietly reminded everyone else that they were not facing another uncertain night alone. Even fear changed shape when shared. The wind outside sounded a little less frightening when someone else heard it too. A nightmare faded more quickly after a whispered prayer from a parent. A crying child settled faster, knowing familiar hands reached out through the darkness. An exhausted traveler, sleeping among strangers, discovered that kindness could arrive in surprisingly ordinary forms: a place near the fire, half a loaf of bread, and enough blanket to make it until dawn. There is something quietly beautiful hidden inside that forgotten custom. Not because communal beds were especially comfortable. By almost every modern standard, they were not. The mattresses sagged. The blankets scratched. Someone certainly snored. Someone almost certainly stole more than their fair share of blanket. Someone's feet probably wandered into territory they had no diplomatic permission to occupy. Yet despite every inconvenience, people continued making room. Literally. They shifted a little closer, curled a little tighter, accepted a little less space so another human being could avoid spending the night outside beneath freezing skies. Perhaps hospitality reaches its purest form when it costs something real. A little warmth, a little comfort, a little sleep. The medieval world understood that lesson instinctively. Over centuries, Europe changed. Cities expanded. Homes became larger. Furniture became more affordable. Privacy slowly transformed from luxury into expectation. Children eventually grew up with separate beds, later separate bedrooms, eventually entire houses where every family member disappeared behind a different door each evening. modern comfort brought undeniable advantages: better hygiene, greater personal safety, more peaceful sleep, a little less accidental elbowing in the middle of the night. History rarely argues against progress, but it occasionally invites us to notice what quietly disappeared along the way. Communal sleeping reflected something larger than architecture. It reflected a society that assumed human beings belonged physically close to one another, not because they necessarily preferred it every single evening, but because life itself worked that way. Neighbors depended upon neighbors. Families depended upon generations living together. Villages depended upon cooperation. Even sleep became another thread weaving individuals into a larger fabric. Perhaps that is why medieval chronicles devote so little attention to this custom. Nobody wrote long descriptions explaining that several people shared one bed. Why would they? It felt no more remarkable than describing rain as wet or fire as warm. The extraordinary only becomes visible after it disappears. Centuries from now, historians may smile at our own invisible habits. Perhaps they will marvel that millions of people voluntarily slept beside glowing electronic devices that occasionally woke them simply to announce someone had liked a photograph. Perhaps they will puzzle over why we surrounded ourselves with extraordinary comfort, yet often struggled to rest. Perhaps they will quietly wonder why people possessing entire bedrooms sometimes reported feeling lonelier than families who once squeezed 6 bodies beneath one wool blanket. Every age carries its own peculiar normal. The medieval world was no exception. Tonight, somewhere beneath layers of history, the echoes of those crowded cottages have long since faded. The timber walls have collapsed into the earth. The straw mattresses have returned to dust. The blankets have vanished thread by thread. The travelers continued their journeys centuries ago. The children grew old. The parents became grandparents. The innkeepers closed their doors for the final time. The monks finished their evening prayers. The apprentices became masters. The stories whispered beneath candlelight dissolved into silence so gradually that no one noticed the exact moment they became history. Only the stones remain. A ruined monastery standing quietly beneath ivy. The foundations of a forgotten farmhouse hidden beneath green fields. An abandoned village where the wind now wanders through empty doorways that once sheltered laughter, whispered conversations, restless sleepers, and strangers who shared one ordinary night before continuing toward entirely different lives. The stars above those places remain almost unchanged. They watched medieval families settling beneath shared blankets. They watched travelers arriving after sunset. They watched fires slowly fade into glowing embers. Tonight, they watch us instead. Perhaps that is the gentlest lesson history offers before sleep finally arrives. Human beings have always searched for warmth. Sometimes in blankets, sometimes in homes, sometimes in the quiet comfort of another person's presence. The ways we seek it change across centuries, but the desire itself remains wonderfully familiar. And as the medieval village grows quiet once more, in your imagination, the last candle burns lower, the final conversation fades into peaceful silence, and the only sound left is the gentle rhythm of countless sleeping breaths carried softly into the darkness. You can let today's worries drift away just as completely. Tomorrow will come just as it always has. The night has carried generations before us safely into morning. Now it can do the same for you.